Connect Run Club podcast episode number 95. The story of Emil Zatopek with Richard Asquith. Hey, welcome back, runners, to the Connect Run Club podcast. Excited to have you back in the house today, the hot house, episode number 95.
So hot.
Temperature number 95, something like that. So welcome back, Brandon. Welcome to you.
I am welcome to be here. It's good to be here. Yeah, we've got a great story for you guys today with Emil Zatopek with Richard Asquith. Richard wrote a great book on Emil, and the title is Today We Die a Little, which is a pretty intense title, but it's a great story. We found out that if you're below 40, you don't know who Emil is. That would be me. And if you're above 40, you do know who Emil is. That would be Trey. But this is kind of like if Michael Phelps or Usain Bolt in 40 years, like only the people that were alive during that time or a little bit after remembered him, and then after that, no one else did. So a crazy story, but before we get into that, I want to let you guys know, as always, about the Summer Running Challenge that we have going on. You can check that out at connectrunclub.com/summer challenge. But we are doing that throughout the summer. This is the second week when this episode goes live, and so you can hear it. Or you can compete in it by running 3 times a week for 20 minutes a day. And if you guys do that, then you're entered to win a free pair of running shoes if you do that for 4 weeks straight. Sounds
good to me.
Then each week we do a $20 giveaway on Amazon as well. And you guys can check that out. So that will actually take you to our Facebook group and our Strava group. And that's kind of where you log your miles and everything. And we've had
a lot of good conversation on that Facebook group.
A lot of good conversation on the Facebook group. We do a Q&A each week on Thursdays. And so that will be the episode right after this. And so if you guys want to ask some questions to Trey, you can get those answered over at our Facebook group. But this week, we want to dive into Emil's story. And Emil is a pretty incredible person in general, not just a runner.
Yeah, there's no doubt. So to give you some perspective on this, imagine not just... you've seen some swimmers and some track stars, win multiple gold medals, but I don't think it's ever been seen where a 5,000 meter runner, a 10,000 meter runner, and a marathon runner not only won a gold medal in each one of those, but also set world records in each one of those in the same Olympics. So he put some unbelievable records out there, unbelievable times. I think he was undefeated at the 10K distance for 6 straight years. Just an unbelievable runner. And then you'll also hear some really cool stories about just an unbelievable person, too, who went through just some tremendous persecution in his day. So
yeah, it's a great story, and especially with the Olympics coming up, we thought it'd be a great time to have Richard on. And we also talk about some mountain running, which they had a cool British term for.
Fell running.
Fell.
It's called fell running. Fell running is what I did in my first ultra marathon.
There you go.
I fell a lot.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like mountain running. I think it's a cool name.
Yeah, and so he is from the UK. He's got a great accent, and he's a pretty big-time journalist over there. So some great books to check out, but we have a blast chatting with him. So without further ado, let's dive into the interview with Richard Asquith.
Well, Richard, thanks again for joining us today. Really excited to talk with you. Got a couple things I'm really excited to talk about. Would love to, can't wait to talk about Emil Zatopek, and also looking forward to kind of talking about kind of the mountain running and fell running, as it's called. So excited to talk about that, and really interesting topics. A lot of people, I think, here in the United States probably have no idea when I mention fell running what I'm talking about. So excited to dig into that. But hey, can you kind of introduce us to, hey, how did you get started running? What is the introduction of your running journey?
So do you want to start with fell running? Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm just an ordinary recreational runner. I just started as a young man of just, like loads of runners do, as a way of just getting my life in order. And, I started doing a bit and found that, how rewarding it is to do this thing where you can escape from the pressures of everyday life, and you can sort of control your own destiny. And the more you put in, the more you get out, and all that sort of thing. So it wasn't until I got to my sort of late 20s, early 30s that I started doing slightly more serious stuff. I've always liked the outdoors and wilderness and mountains and things like that. I know our English mountains are fairly small compared with the ones you get in the States, but I mean they can still be pretty rough and steep, and we have terrible weather over most of our mountains. And I spent quite a few years just hiking in them, as people do. And then I discovered there was this traditional sport called fell running. So fell is like the little local word for mountain up in the northern parts in Cumbria. And I discovered this amazing tradition of people who we'd never heard of outside the little corners where they did it. But possibly some of the greatest athletes that Britain has ever produced were doing these crazy races where it's just not even on tracks. It's just going up as fast as you can over rock and mud and heather and boulders and the whole lot, and then just sprinting down absolutely flat out. It's the most amazing sport to watch and to take part in as well.
What is a typical distance? Is there a specific distance? Does the distance vary, or the races?
Distances vary so much. I mean, there's like sort of two possible extremes. One extreme is the really suicidal, flat out stuff where you're maybe it's a mile up and a mile down would probably be the absolute minimum, and it's all to do with just just how fast you are and how crazy you are. And then at the other extreme, we have events or challenges that go on all day, sometimes more than one day. 50s. I think the most I ever did was getting on for 70 miles in 24 hours. Or 66 miles, something like that. But and then it's a different kind of running. It's more about just sort of keeping going and the stamina and the navigation. Not getting lost is a big challenge in British mountains.
I'm sure. Hey, talk about the what have you learned about the particular challenge of running downhill? Because I think I've heard you mention this before. Because I'm with you. I'd much rather I enjoy it uphill rather than downhill. Downhill, I feel like I'm killing myself. But talk to us about some of the challenges, especially of running downhill.
Well, downhill is the tricky bit. I mean, everyone assumes that the hard work is going up, but it's the opposite road running, where you sort of might have a bit of a rest on the downhill. The downhill you really got to concentrate on. I mean, it's a sort of bit of a paradox, really, because once you kids, a small kid, put them on a steep mountainside or something, and they'll do it perfectly because they have no common sense or self-preservation. But once you become a sort of sensible adult, it becomes very, very difficult to do because all your instincts are telling you to be sensible and keep it under control and so forth. But in fact, the more you keep yourself under control, the more work your legs are having to do, because you're having to bring all your weight almost to a halt at every step. So the secret of doing it well is just to let go. I mean, fell runners say, when you turn at the top, disengage the brain, or brakes off, brain off, and the ones who can just bring themselves to be totally crazy and just relax, they're not just going faster, they're doing much less work, so they're less exhausted at the bottom. And the one drawback, of course, is that you tend to accelerate and accelerate and accelerate, and it can get out of control with quite disastrous results. But it's very, very good fun. So
I've heard people describe like running downhill, and they're always like, "Hey, just let gravity do its work." I'm like, "Well, I could jump out of a plane and let gravity do its work." I'm like, hey, I don't know. I feel good about that,
Exactly. Well, it does feel quite good, but you hope you've got a parachute at some point. Yeah,
that's all right. What's the participation like in races over there in these?
It's gone up a bit in recent years. I mean, when I wrote my book about fell running, Feet in the Clouds, that came out about 10 years ago, or 12 years ago, and at that time, people were worrying that it was slightly dying out. There are all these sort of people, these old men who've been doing it. It was just like an old local tradition, and generation after generation they'd start doing it as a kid, and they'd be working on the fields as shepherds or whatever, and there'd be a really close bond between man and mountain. There was a slight sense that in the modern world, people have so many alternatives available to them. The young athlete can do everything from triathlon to adventure racing to cycling to this, that. There's so much choice, and so you didn't get this automatic thing of local talent automatically going into fell racing. I think in recent years there's been a bit of a revival. It's slightly hard to know where to draw the line, because you get these things like adventure racing, and I know that over in the States you have this sort of the organised adventure races and the tough mudders and things like that, which are clearly totally different from fell running as a sport, but at the same time there's an overlap among the sort of people who do it. I mean, go back 30 years and the running boom just meant people running on pavements and roads and occasionally on tracks. I think loads of us have found that, great as that is, is not the only thing, and everyone wants their own variety, and mountains are certainly one thing that brings adventure. but I mean, you're talking very small numbers.
Yeah.
I think the Fell Running Association of Britain's maybe got 7,000 members, perhaps.
Gotcha. Do you, and I think just by hearing you talk about it, you're kind of like me. It's one of those things that when you get out there and have you experience it, your family experience, your kids experience it. To me, it's as I've done different races like that over here. It's a captivating moment for people who haven't been a part of it. You kind of find the same thing over there. Once people get out and experience, it's one of those things that just kind of captivates people.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, well, for a start, in Britain, it's a wonderful sort of community experience, and you have a little village race or something like that, and everyone comes out and does it together. So there's that side of things, the camaraderie. But also what I love about it is because there's so much that can go wrong in terms of falling over and getting lost and all that sort of stuff. You just have to concentrate so much that it's utterly absorbing, as you say. And by the time you've been doing that for a few hours, you've forgotten all your other worries, and you just feel like you've been focusing on nothing except the mountains. It's a race between you and the mountain as much as between you and your fellow runners.
Can you track? Do you kind of know the kind of background history of where it started? Because like in the United States, like when we look at a race like Western States, hey, we know how that started with Gordon Ansley and kind of what that goes back to. Do you have kind of a background of when and kind of how this all started?
A little bit. I think it mainly what happened was in the sort of early-ish 19th century, the rich leisured classes from the south began to go to the remoter parts of Britain as tourists, and the mountains were a very strange and slightly dangerous environment. So they used to hire local guides to show them the safe routes up the mountains and the most beautiful routes. And then, being sort of English aristocrats, they started sort of having bets with one another and saying, "My guide is faster than your guide. I bet you 50 guineas." And so forth. And so some of the races sort of slightly started like that. I know there's one famous race, the Burnshall race, allegedly started as a bet in a pub, and the first one to do it actually ran naked after sort of put his clothes up in the bar and went up and came down again. So they have all these little traditions, and some. I mean, elsewhere in Europe, there's a great France, I know it's like digressing there, which in the Pyrenees, which started off because the Victorian tourists used to come there, and it was so hot that they used to want ice, and so any local person who could get up to the top of the mountain, hack off a backpack full of ice, and then get down before it melted, could sell it for a lot of money. And so they gradually started this race, and it was all started with people just running flat out downhill with backpacks full of heavy ice.
Well, I know one thing. When you mentioned the Pyrenees, I've been watching the Tour. And so anybody who's crazy enough to run in those mountains. And you know what's astounding to me, speaking of the Pyrenees, they were mentioning the other day, I could not believe this, but they're talking like when these guys are at the bottom of the mountain, it may be 75 degrees. This is in the summer. And by the time they get to the top, it might be 55 degrees. I mean, what a drastic temperature change in an environment like that.
Yes, well, that's one of the interesting things. I mean, you get that even on our little mountains. It's one of the challenges that all the time you have to be aware, because that can bring all sorts of risks of, from extreme heat at the bottom to extreme cold at the top. And, British fell runners are increasingly very, very aware that everyone, especially the novices, has to be made aware that, at the top of the mountain, things can change very rapidly, and things can become dangerously cold very rapidly, and you have to be properly equipped.
What does training look like for you? Are you out hitting stuff often, or what does training look like for you?
For me, at my age, I just run for fun. I normally, I don't live by the mountains. I live just in the sort of normal up and down countryside, and I just go out with my dog and run off road. I mean, I think the great thing is, what I love about running, and what I find so spiritually refreshing about it, I guess, is the sort of sense of really being in contact with the landscape all the time. And I just love feeling the different ground, like the textures of the different kinds of texture of the ground beneath my feet and that sort of thing. And it's all part of the thing of just being absorbed in your surroundings and in the environment.
That's really good. Yep. The Hey, would love to dig in now. Excited to talk about Emil Zatopek, and one of the things that's neat to me is I'll just give you a for instance. Like right now in the United States, we've got, I'm sure you know him, Galen Rupp, and Galen qualified for the Olympics in the marathon, and he just qualified in the 10,000, and he missed it in the 5. He wasn't going to run that anyway. So when you look at that, you're like, that's outstanding. Well, no, what's outstanding is a guy who will win the gold medal in the marathon, win it in the 5,000, win it in the 10,000, and set world records in all 3 races in the same Olympics. So, one of the things that excites me about this conversation is we had a chance to talk with Hal Higdon a few weeks ago, and he was like a walking history book of runners. And so I feel it's easy to kind of lose sight of what some of these founding fathers of running really went through. And I think this is a story that a lot of people really don't know about.
Right. Okay. Well, I think he's just an amazingly interesting person. I mean, I'm just about old enough to have remembered as a teenager, probably just reading stories about the mystery of because one of the things about Emil Zatopek, he lived in communist Czechoslovakia, or it was communist for most of his life, and after the Prague Spring in 1968, which was the liberalization movement, and the Soviets came in and crushed that, and all the reformers suffered terribly. He was one of the reformers, and so he sort of disappeared. And I remember growing up, and people talked about where was Emil Zatopek and what had happened to him, and it was all a bit of a mystery. And through that, then I discovered about his amazing achievements in the 40s and the 50s. But I think partly because he was, slightly airbrushed out of history in his own land. For quite a long time, really until the Velvet Revolution and afterwards, and he died in 2000. There was this sort of big gap, and he went from being, in the 1950s, I think he was, you could easily say he was the most famous sportsman in the world. I reckon he was probably easily, he was like Muhammad Ali, but a decade earlier. Everyone, and I find in Britain and elsewhere, if you ask someone in their 80s and 90s, even if they have absolutely no interest in sport at all, you mention Emil Zatopek and they say, oh yeah, I remember him, because he was just a legend. But I talk to young people, people in their 30s who know lots about running, very into sport. Loads of them had never heard of him, and I found that quite shocking. But there obviously was this sort of big gap in memory, and my book is an attempt. Today We Die Little is really an attempt to sort of rescue Zatopek's amazing story.
That's great. Can you, one of the things, I think the numbers that stick out to me, just from a running perspective with him, I believe he went 6 years without losing the 10,000 meter race or something like that. I mean, just something mind blowing. That's hard to believe.
No, I think you got it right. I can't remember the exact number, but it certainly was 6 years. And when he went to the London Olympics in 1948, he'd only run the distance twice. And he won the gold medal so convincingly that he lapped so many people so often that the timekeepers became hopelessly confused, and they ended up recording official places only for the first 11 finishers, and even then two of the places were wrong, had to be changed afterwards. Wow. So he was an amazing talent at 10,000 meters, and it sounds not much today, but he was the first person to run under 29 minutes, which at the time was just considered impossible. And I think when he achieved that the same week, he also broke the world record for 5,000 meters. But to me, the most amazing thing at all was at the Helsinki Olympics in 1952, when he won gold in 5,000 meters and 10,000 meters and the marathon. He'd never run a marathon before. It was like, it was almost, it seemed like, it wasn't quite an afterthought, but it seemed like an afterthought. And he just went and introduced himself to the favourite at the beginning and said, hello, I'm Zatopek. And this is Jim Peters, the Englishman. And he just sort of tried to follow him. And then about halfway through, he sort of spurted away.
What about in Czechoslovakia itself? Was he kind of forgotten there as well? I mean, was he kind of written off in his home country also?
I mean, he was eventually, when he was running, he was like the biggest national hero ever. It was like, it was very difficult for him because he was constantly in demand. He was, before 1948, Czechoslovakia, I think they'd once won a bronze medal in gymnastics, and that was a complete Olympic total of medals. And then suddenly Zatopek wins gold in the 10,000 meters and silver in the 5,000 meters. And Czechoslovakia is on the map suddenly, and the communists just loved it because they'd just come to power in 1948. He was constantly wheeled out everywhere. He was always giving talks to people, to young people and to groups of workers and things like that. There were posters, there were victory parades, all that sort of stuff. He was the national hero. And then in 1952, after he won that amazing treble, and he was the most celebrated sportsman in the world, they just couldn't get enough of him. So, he couldn't go anywhere without being mobbed. He was a wonderfully kind and generous man. He always had time. He never said no to anyone. He always had time to talk to people, no matter how obscure they were. He'd always sort of sign an autograph and be encouraging to people. But it was a terrible strain on him. And then suddenly, I don't know if you remember, Ron Clark, the great Australian runner, visited him in 1966, and Ron told me how Emil took him shopping, and it was right in the middle of the busiest time of day, and Emil just sort of parked his car in the wrong place, and policeman came running up, blowing his whistle, saying, "You can't do that." And then as soon as he saw who it was, he burst into smiles and said, "Oh, of course, sign my autograph." And so the policeman guarded the car while he went shopping, and then they came back and drove to another shop, and exactly the same thing happened. Another policeman comes charging up, and then he said, "Oh, Emil, he looked up to your car for you." He was a mega celebrity. But then after 1968, then not only was he he was chucked out of the army and chucked out of the Communist Party and stripped of his role in sport, and he had to go and work as an itinerant labourer miles from Prague for several years. Not only that, but he all the stuff about being a national hero immediately stopped, and his sort of name disappeared from textbooks. And in his own town there was a stadium named after him, and they changed the name of that, and his statue disappeared. He became unmentionable, as tended to happen in communist countries. And I think his reputation never really, in his homeland, recovered from that. He died in 2000, and I remember his younger brother Jerzy, saying he travelled all over the world, and everywhere he went he was welcomed, but in his own country he was an outcast. And I think quite a lot of people felt that he was quite badly treated by the Czech sporting establishment. Although interestingly, at Rio this year, I think they're finally trying to put that right, and you'll see a lot of sort of Zatopek symbols and things like that at Rio when the Czech team appear.
That's great. It's really interesting to me, and I would love if you can confirm this. I think I've heard a story too, and I don't know if it was the same Australian athlete, but I read a scenario about him giving one of his surprise gold medals. Is that the same athlete?
I'll tell you that it's the same athlete, and not only that, it was 50 years ago next week. I think 50 years ago on Tuesday that it actually happened. So they had that visit. Ron Clark. So I don't know if your listeners know about Ron Clark or not, if it's just I'm too old, but he was fantastic, another fantastic distance runner. He was set 17 world records. He broke a lot of Emil Zatopek's gold medals. The one thing he didn't have was he was always unlucky when it came to the big tournaments, and he never won Olympic gold. He never won Commonwealth Games gold. Eventually, his last attempt at the Olympics was in 1968 when I don't know if you remember, but he sort of virtually died. He sort of collapsed at the 10,000 meters because he wasn't used to the altitude. But back even in 1966, Emil Zatopek admired Clark enormously. He thought he was the most graceful runner ever, possibly. Yeah. And he really felt for him, and so he invited Clark over, and Clark runs in a race, and then Emil just looks after him for several days, and they go training together, and then they go shopping together, as I was describing just then. And right at the very end, Emil takes him to the airport, and they're saying goodbye, and he shakes his hand, and he just sort of Clark feels him put something into his hand, and he says, "This is for you because you deserve it." Clark doesn't say anything because he thinks he's probably being asked to smuggle something gossip out of the country or something like that. So he just sort of grips onto it, and then even in the plane, he's sort of saying, "If I was still in Czech airspace, I better not do anything." So he just holds onto it. And then I think it was eventually when they sort of landed in London, and they were taxiing around, and he was changing flights there. And eventually, curiosity overcomes him. So it's this little package sort of wrapped up in brown paper and string, and he sort of unwraps it, has a look, and it's one of Emil Zatopek's gold medals from Helsinki Olympics, a little box, and it sort of says inside inside the box to Ron Clark from Emil Zatopek, Prague, 19th of July, 1966. And Clark is so moved, he weeps, and afterwards he says, I remembered his words to me, that because you deserve it, and I just wish I had. And it's just a typical act of. I mean, I could actually go on for hours about all the different acts of kindness and things like that Zatopek did. But to him, sport was always about friendship rather than just winning at all costs. But that gesture, particularly, which he never really thought anyone would find out about. I think even his wife didn't find out for several years, and then she was furious when she noticed one of his medals was missing. But he was a very, very generous person as well as an amazing athlete.
As you kind of dug into Emil and kind of who he was and his history, were there any things that kind of surprised you as you kind of dug into his story?
Well, there was a lot to dig into. I mean, I spent quite a lot of time in his hometown in Koprivnica, which is right in a fairly remote part of Moravia. And it was surprising how many people, still remembered him. There were no immediate family members. Well, his nephew and niece were still alive, but school friends and things like that. I was very struck by the great poverty that he grew up in. I saw pictures of him going barefoot to school, and a Christmas present in the Zatopek household meant his mother would go out into the garden, get an apple and wrap it up, and that would be a Christmas present. And his father I think one of the reasons though he was basically sympathetic to the idea of communism was that he was growing up in terrible poverty and the Great Depression. His father was a trade union activist, and he even became a founder member of the Communist Party. So there was that side of things. And then later on, when Emil was being used as a propaganda icon for the communists, some people said he was too close to them. I was able to look into his military records, and also later on the records of the Secret Service used to spy on everyone and record everything anyone did. And there was amazing stuff there, and you could see. It's very interesting how, he wasn't always standing up to them. Sometimes he was, sometimes he wasn't. He took some huge risks, and he was directly ordered to inform on someone, and he refused. But at other times, he was going along with what they said, and there are terribly dangerous times for anyone in Czechoslovakia, even the most famous people. But I suppose his achievements were so great that he could get away with stuff that other people couldn't get away with. And of course, the most famous occasion was just before the Helsinki Olympics. So, if you imagine, he's at the peak of his powers. He's 29 years old. He's going to Helsinki, and he's got a slight sense that he might be able to win all three distance running golds. The day before, they go to collect their plane tickets. He finds that one of his teammates, a friend of his, hasn't got his ticket, and it turns out that because his father has been convicted of political offences, or is in some sort of trouble for the political subversion, they've decided that it's not appropriate for this bloke to travel abroad. So Emil then says, right, well, if he's not going, I'm not going. And so he puts his entire sporting career, probably his liberty as well, at risk by just digging his heels in and saying, I'm not going to go unless Stanislav Ljungberg is put back in the team. And he takes it so far to the wire that eventually the Czechoslovakian plane takes off without them and flies to Helsinki without them. And all the Finns are sort of waiting for the great Zatopek to arrive, and he's not there. Eventually, the day, possibly 2 days later, the Communist Party caves in, and they send Zatopek and Ljungberg off on a second plane. And yet, while they're going, I think the army draw up a plan for the exemplary punishment of Captain Zatopek, which would probably have meant going off to the concentration camps. Luckily, he won so many gold medals at Helsinki that then they tore that plan up. But there's a huge amount of pressure on him. And if you think of the risk, I can think of the only comparison I can make. Not just putting his liberty at risk, but also just risking missing the greatest sporting opportunity of his life when he's at the absolute height of his powers. To me, it's like Muhammad Ali, refusing the draft to Vietnam and thus missing the absolute peak years of his career. I mean, Ali gambled, and in that sense he lost, and Zatopek gambled, and in that sense he won. But it's the same sort of greatness of spirit, which I think is much more than sporting greatness.
Yeah, and I think that's the part of this story that I really love, and I would love to get your thoughts on this, is the fact that, his running performances and his numbers speak for themselves. And I think when people see those, they're like, what in the world? But would love if you, and I know you've talked a little bit about it, kind of the friendships, relationships, but would love if you could give kind of some runners who are listening to this, who maybe maybe are not familiar with Emil. Could you give us a snapshot of who he really was from a person? I mean, could you give us some description of, this is the kind of person that he was? These are kind of the characteristics that really kind of marked Emil?
I think he was just a very, very generous person. Everyone talked about how he used to make people's lives lighter. He was always doing these big, small acts of kindness. I remember one British athlete told me how he was. He went to Helsinki, but then he was ill, so he couldn't run very well. But nonetheless, Emil sort of went out and found him and just sent his condolences. Later on in life, when living in Prague, especially in the house he built in Prague, Emil had this amazing hospitality, and you'll find all sorts of stories out there. You probably I know people in America who've done it, who just turned up on his doorstep saying, I'm a running fan, I want to meet the great Emil Zatopek, and Emil would say, come in, and he'd entertain them and feed them and have them to stay even, and there was almost a compulsion to be generous to people. I think that's one of, I know his army superiors complained that he would never say no to anyone. I think that's seen as sort of weakness in him, but I think he was just this sort of amazingly kind person. And Dana, his wife, discovered that because he developed such a reputation for this ridiculously generous hospitality, that there was a local campsite near their house, and they started finding that if they were full up, they'd just send people up to the Zatopek's house because they knew they'd always be taken in. So he's very, very kind, but he's also funny, and he was always joking and things like that. And even during race, I mean, if you watch footage of the marathon in Helsinki in 1952, there's a little bit I've seen where he's following the press car or van or whatever it was, and you can see him sort of joking with the cameraman and saying, give me a lift, sort of stuff, which is pretty, he just had this, no matter how hard he was trying, and he certainly did try it amazingly hard, he always had this sort of, this grace, this sense of humanity. I think he was a wonderful and exceptional human being.
That's fantastic, and we know his sense of humor. I know the first couple things I ever found of him were some of his quotes, and some of his quotes just absolutely hilarious. So, right, yeah. So just hey, so I would encourage you. Thanks again for your time today, Richard, and I would encourage our runners. We're going to put the link to the book in the show notes. This is of many things that we can do. One of the things I love to do, and Brandon, I know he's the same way. We love to be able to learn the kind of history, background, and what are the lessons we can learn. And there are some amazing lessons we can learn that help us in running and just help us in life from a runner like Emil. So, Richard, we appreciate the work you did on this, and we appreciate your time talking with you today as well.
Not at all. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your interest.
Absolutely. You too. Thanks, Richard.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thanks.
All right. Goodbye.